In France, it's illegal for your boss to email you after work hours. In Japan, you can be punished for not taking vacation days. And in one country, employers must legally provide break time for dating. In another, your company can be fined thousands of dollars if you don't use your sick days. And believe it or not, in some places, your boss legally cannot call you by the wrong name or give you a nickname without your permission. Let me explain these wild employment laws that actually exist around the world and why they were created in the first place. Hey everyone, welcome back to GeoInfo 14, and today we're diving deep into employment laws that sound too crazy to be true, but they're 100% real and currently enforced. I've spent weeks researching and verifying everything with official government sources, legal databases, and international labor organizations. So stick around, because we're covering 8 shocking employment laws from around the globe, and number 8 is going to completely blow your mind. Before we dive in, let me give you some context. Employment laws exist to balance power between employers and workers. Every country has a different philosophy about this balance. Some countries prioritize individual freedom and let employers and employees negotiate their own terms. Other countries believe workers need strong legal protections to prevent exploitation. What's fascinating is that the same job in the same industry can have completely different rules depending on which country you're in. A software engineer in the United States has drastically different rights compared to a software engineer in France or Australia or Japan. And these differences aren't small. We're talking about laws that determine how many hours you can work, whether you can be fired, how much vacation time you get, and even whether your boss can contact you outside of work. So let's explore these laws, understand why they exist, and see how different countries approach worker protection. Let's start with France, and one of the most talked about employment laws in recent years. In 2017, France passed what they call the Right to Disconnect law. This law applies to any company in France with more than 50 employees. Here's what it says. Your boss legally cannot expect you to answer work emails, text messages, or phone calls outside of your official working hours. Now, you might be thinking, well, that makes sense. When you're off work, right? But here's the thing. In most countries, including the United States, there's absolutely no law preventing your employer from expecting you to be available 24/7. In the U.S., especially in industries like tech, finance, consulting, and sales, there's this unspoken rule that you should always be reachable. Your boss emails you at 9 p.m., you better respond. Weekend emergency? You better be on that call. This constant connectivity has become normalized, but France said, no, we're putting a legal stop to this. Why did they do this? Studies conducted by French health organizations and labor groups found that constant work connectivity was causing severe mental health problems among employees. Workers reported higher levels of stress, anxiety, burnout, and even depression. They felt like they could never truly disconnect from work, which meant they never fully rested or spent quality time with family. The French government looked at this data and decided this was a public health issue that needed legal intervention. So they created a law that protects employees' personal time and reduces burnout. Here's how it works in practice. Companies with more than 50 employees must negotiate with their workers or unions to establish hours when employees are not required to send or answer work-related emails. Some companies set it as 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. on weekdays, plus full weekends. Other companies have different arrangements based on their industry. If a company violates this law repeatedly, they can face penalties and fines. More importantly, employees have the legal right to ignore work communications outside of their designated hours without any fear of retaliation. Now compare this to the United States. There is zero federal protection for this. In most U.S. states, your employer can expect you to be available whenever they want. And if you don't respond to that midnight email, you could be reprimanded, passed over for promotion, or even fired in at-will employment states. The cultural difference is stark. In France, the law says rest and personal time are fundamental rights. In the U.S., the prevailing attitude is that being constantly available shows dedication and commitment. Which approach is better? Well, French workers report higher job satisfaction and better work-life balance, while American workers often report higher productivity, but also higher stress levels. It's a trade-off based on different values. Now, let's move to Japan, a country famous for its intense work culture. Japan has a word that doesn't exist in most other languages, karoshi. It literally means death from overwork. And yes, it's a legally recognized cause of death in Japan. For decades, Japan had one of the most extreme work cultures in the world. Employees regularly worked 60, 70, even 80 hours per week. Overtime was not just expected, it was essentially mandatory. Taking vacation days was seen as lazy or disloyal to your company. Many workers accumulated vacation days year after year and never used them. The results were tragic. Every year, hundreds of Japanese workers would literally die from overwork, usually from heart attacks, strokes, or suicide brought on by extreme stress and exhaustion. The government tracked these deaths and officially recognized them as work-related fatalities. Something had to change. So in 2019, the Japanese government passed a major labor reform law. One key provision: employers are now required by law to ensure that employees take at least 5 days of their paid vacation annually. Now, 5 days might not sound like much. Many countries mandate 20 or even 30 days of vacation. But for Japan, this was revolutionary. Before this law, it was common for employees to take 0 vacation days per year. Here's how the law works. If an employer fails to ensure that employees take their legally required vacation days, the company faces fines of up to 300,000 yen per employee. That's roughly $2,000 per worker. For a large company, this can add up to millions in fines. The law also caps overtime at 45 hours per month for most workers, with some industry exceptions. Companies that force employees to work excessive overtime can face serious legal consequences. This law came after decades of pressure from labor groups, families of karoshi victims, and international criticism of Japan's work culture. The government finally acknowledged that extreme overwork was a national crisis that required legal intervention. But here's what's interesting. Even with this law, Japanese work culture is still more intense than most Western countries. The law mandates only 5 vacation days, whereas countries like France, Germany, and Spain mandate 20 to 30 days. Now contrast this with the United States. There is zero federal law requiring employers to provide any paid vacation days. Zero. In most developed countries, paid vacation is a legal right. In the U.S., it's a benefit that employers can choose to offer or not offer. Many American workers get vacation days through their employment contracts, but there's no legal requirement. And many low-wage workers, part-time workers, and contract workers get no paid time off at all. So Japan went from one extreme, where vacation was culturally taboo, to at least having a legal minimum. The U.S. has no federal minimum at all. Now, let's talk about South Korea, which has one of the most unusual employment laws I've ever heard of. South Korea is facing a demographic crisis. Their birth rate is the lowest in the entire world. In 2023, the average South Korean woman had only 0.72 children in her lifetime. To maintain a stable population, you need a birth rate of about 2.1. South Korea is nowhere close. Why is this happening? There are many factors. Housing is extremely expensive in cities like Seoul. Education costs are high. Work culture is intense. And many young people simply don't have time to date or build relationships because they're working so much. The government is desperate to reverse this trend. So they've been experimenting with all kinds of policies to encourage people to have more children. One of the most creative approaches involves employment law. Some tech companies and startups in South Korea, with government encouragement, have started offering what they call dating leave or relationship leave. This is extra paid time off specifically for single employees to go on dates and build romantic relationships. Now, this isn't mandatory nationwide yet. It's not a federal law that all companies must follow, but it's becoming increasingly common, especially in industries like tech, where companies are competing for young talent. Some companies give single employees an extra day off per month for dating. Others offer longer periods, like a full week per year. The idea is to give workers time and mental space to pursue relationships that might lead to marriage and eventually children. When you think about it, it's a pretty wild concept. Your employer is essentially incentivizing you to date. But from the government's perspective, it makes sense. If work culture is preventing people from forming relationships, then maybe changing work culture is part of the solution. Critics argue that this puts too much pressure on workers' personal lives, and that the government should focus on other issues like housing costs and childcare. But supporters say it shows that employers recognize work-life balance is important for employees' personal happiness, not just productivity. Whether it will actually increase birth rates remains to be seen, but it's a fascinating example of how employment law can be used to address broader social issues. Now, let's head to Germany, where they take rest and family time so seriously that they've made it illegal for most businesses to operate on Sundays. Germany has a law called the Ladenschlussgesetz, which translates to the shop closing law. This law, which has roots going back many decades, requires most stores and businesses to close on Sundays and public holidays. There are exceptions, of course. Essential services like hospitals, police, fire departments, and public transportation continue operating. Restaurants, cafes, and hotels can stay open because they're considered hospitality services. Gas stations can operate, but regular retail stores, supermarkets, offices, and most other businesses must close. Why does this law exist? It's rooted in both religious tradition and workers' rights. Historically, Sunday was considered a day of rest in Christian-majority Germany. But beyond religion, the law is now justified primarily as a worker protection measure. The philosophy is this: if businesses were allowed to open 7 days a week, workers would be pressured or forced to work 7 days a week. By legally requiring businesses to close one day, workers are guaranteed at least 1 day of rest to spend with family, pursue hobbies, or simply relax. Violating this law comes with hefty fines. If a business opens on Sunday without proper authorization, they can be fined thousands of euros. Repeat violations can lead to even larger penalties. Now, there's ongoing debate in Germany about whether this law should be relaxed. Some argue that in a modern globalized economy, Sunday closing laws are outdated and inconvenient for consumers. Others argue that protecting workers' rest days is more important than shopping convenience. Compare this to the United States, where Sunday is treated like any other day. Most retail stores, restaurants, and businesses operate normal hours. Workers in these industries often have no choice but to work weekends if their employer schedules them. In the U.S., the philosophy tends to be that businesses should be free to operate whenever they want, and workers can negotiate their schedules individually. In Germany, the law says that society as a whole benefits when everyone gets a guaranteed day of rest. It's another example of how different countries balance economic freedom with worker protection. Now let's look at Australia, which has some of the strongest employment protections in the world. Australia's Fair Work Act is a comprehensive piece of legislation that gives workers significant rights that don't exist in many other countries. Let me break down some of the key protections. First, you cannot be fired without a valid reason. In Australia, this is called protection against unfair dismissal. If your employer wants to fire you, they must have a legitimate reason, such as poor performance, misconduct, or genuine redundancy due to business restructuring. They can't just fire you because they don't like you, or for arbitrary reasons. If you believe you've been unfairly dismissed, you can file a claim with the Fair Work Commission, which is a government tribunal. They'll investigate your case, and if they find the dismissal was unfair, they can order your employer to reinstate you with back pay or provide compensation. Compare this to the United States, where most employment is at will. This means your employer can fire you at any time, for any reason, or for no reason at all, as long as it's not explicitly illegal discrimination. You don't like someone's attitude? Fire them. You just feel like reducing staff? Fire them. There's very little legal protection. Second, Australian workers get generous paid time off. The law mandates 10 days of paid sick leave per year. If you don't use all your sick days, they accumulate year after year. Some long-term employees end up with months of accumulated sick leave. Workers also get a minimum of 4 weeks of paid annual vacation, which is called annual leave in Australia. Again, if you don't use it, it accumulates. And when you leave a job, your employer must pay out all your unused. There's also paid parental leave. New parents can take up to 18 weeks of government-funded parental leave, and many employers offer additional paid leave on top of that. Third, Australia has a strong minimum wage that's regularly adjusted for inflation. As of 2024, the national minimum wage is over 23 Australian dollars per hour, which is about 15 US dollars. And this is for all workers, including casual and part-time workers. Fourth, workers have strong protections around working hours and overtime. If you're asked to work unreasonable additional hours beyond your contract, you have the legal right to refuse. Your employer can't fire you or punish you for refusing unreasonable overtime. The philosophy behind Australia's Fair Work Act is that workers deserve dignity, security, and fair treatment. The law recognizes that there's an inherent power imbalance between employers and employees, so the government creates legal protections to level the playing field. Critics argue that these strong protections make it harder for businesses to operate efficiently and can discourage hiring. Supporters argue that treating workers fairly leads to a more productive, stable, and happy workforce, which benefits everyone. Now, let's talk about a law that's spreading across Europe and beyond. The right to disconnect, but taken even further. We talked about France earlier, but at least 17 countries now have some form of right to disconnect laws. This includes Italy, Spain, Belgium, Ireland, Portugal, Greece, Slovakia, and others. Each country's version is slightly different, but the core principle is the same. Workers have a legal right to not engage with work outside of their working hours. In some countries, like Belgium, the law requires companies to establish clear policies about when employees can and cannot be contacted. In Ireland, workers have a legal code of practice that gives them the right to not routinely perform work outside normal hours, to not be penalized for refusing to attend to work matters outside normal hours, and to disconnect from work devices. What's interesting is how this law challenges traditional thinking about productivity and dedication. For decades, especially in the US and Asia, being available 24/7 was seen as a sign of commitment and ambition. The harder you worked, the more hours you put in, the more dedicated you were. But research is now showing that this approach leads to burnout, mental health problems, and actually decreases productivity in the long run. Workers who are constantly stressed and never fully rest make more mistakes, have lower creativity, and are more likely to quit. Countries with right to disconnect laws are essentially saying, rest is not laziness. Boundaries are not lack of commitment. A healthy worker is a productive worker. The United States still has no such protections. Some individual companies, especially in tech, have started implementing their own no email after hours policies voluntarily. But there's no legal requirement. Now, let me tell you about one of the most specific and unusual employment laws I've found. And this one comes from multiple European countries. In Sweden, the Netherlands, and a few other countries, there are laws that protect workers' dignity and personal identity in very specific ways. One aspect of this is that your employer cannot force you to accept a nickname or be called by a name you haven't approved. This might sound trivial, but think about the implications. In many workplaces, bosses or co-workers give people nicknames. Sometimes these are friendly and welcome, but sometimes they're demeaning, based on stereotypes, or just something the person doesn't like. In countries with these protections, if your boss insists on calling you Johnny when your name is John, and you've asked them to use your proper name and they refuse, that could be considered a violation of your workplace rights. You could file a complaint. Similarly, there are laws protecting workers from being forced to dress in ways that violate their personal or religious beliefs, unless there's a genuine safety or business necessity. For example, if you're required to wear a uniform for branding purposes, that's usually considered legitimate. In the United States, these protections are much weaker. Employers have broad discretion to set dress codes, appearance standards, and workplace policies. As long as they're not discriminating based on protected categories like race, religion, or gender, they can enforce pretty much whatever rules they want. So what can we learn from all these different employment laws around the world? First, there's no universal agreement on how to balance employer rights and worker rights. Every country makes different choices based on their history, culture, and values. Second, employment laws are constantly evolving. What was acceptable 20 years ago might be considered exploitative today. Countries are learning from each other and adapting their laws to address new challenges like remote work, gig economy jobs, and AI in the workplace. Third, these laws have real impacts on people's lives. Whether you can disconnect from work, take vacation, refuse unreasonable demands, or challenge unfair treatment. These legal protections shape your quality of life, your mental health, and your dignity as a worker. Which of these laws shocked you the most? Which ones do you wish existed in your country? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive valuable, make sure to subscribe to GeoInfo 14. We post new videos breaking down laws, rights, and fascinating differences between countries around the world. For all the sources, official government documents, and legal citations I used to verify every law in this video, check the description below. Everything you heard today is verified and accurate as of 2026. Stay informed, stay curious, and remember, knowing your rights is the first step to protecting them. See you in the next video.